Hi, my name is Victor Bart, welcome to Retro Machines, and the topic is 440BX chipsets and the motherboards. So in this video I'm gonna talk about the 440BX chipset and why I think it's one of the best Intel chipsets ever made, and I'm gonna show you some motherboards that I really love with that chipset. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. If you want your circuit board design realized and printed, you should check out PCBWay. Starting prices as low as $5 for a 1 or 2 layer design with worldwide shipping. Place your order now, links in the description. In this box there's a brand new Asus P2B-DS. So we have the Intel 440BX chipset, and what I like about the chipset is that it was like the standard chipset for a lot of things, but also a high-end chipset with dual CPU support, so also a workstation chipset. And after the 440BX with the Intel 815 for the consumers and the 820 and the 840 for more the professional stuff, they split it up, and the 440BX supports up to 1 GB of memory, and the Intel 815 chipset only supported 512. So it was a little step back. And with the Intel 820 and the 840 chipsets, they started with Rambus, and we all know that was pretty much a failure. And the 440BX chip has a 100 MHz frontside bus and supports Pentium 2, 233 to 400 MHz here on the box. But actually the chipset was so good that it supported 133 MHz frontside buses, only with the HCP was then also running way overclocked at the PCI slots. But the motherboard and the chipsets handled that fine. So sometimes some video cards or other expansion cards didn't work as well. Here it says up to 400, but it basically supported all the slot 1 CPUs. So sometimes with little voltage mods or slot cats or stuff like that, but there was so much more potential in this chipset. So we have 1 HP slot of course, and the 440BX chipset supports 4 memory banks up to 1 GB of memory. And here it says PC 100, but if you run it on 133 MHz frontside bus, you also need PC 133 of course. This motherboard also have onboard SCSI, and other variants also support onboard LAN. So let's show you some motherboards that I really like with the 440BX chipset. So the first motherboard that I'm gonna show you is the Asus P2BF. And you also have the Asus P2B. That is the earliest model with the 440BX chipset. And that one has 4 PCI slots and 3 ISA slots. So if you have a build where you want to have more ISA slots, go for the Asus P2B. But otherwise just go for the P2BF or the next one that I show you. This motherboard has some jumpers here where you can set the front side buses, but only a few possibilities. So you can overclock a little bit but not fine tune it. And also 4 memory banks, a slot 1 CPU that goes here, standard I/O, so PS2, USB, 2 COM ports, parallel port. And you have also the P2B LS, and then you have a LAN port, and you have SCSI on board. So that's a variant, but that's also a single CPU motherboard, because we also have, I think this is my favorite motherboard ever made. It's the Asus P2B-DS. So dual CPU, 2 CPUs and SCSI. And this is an Adaptec 2040 Ultra 2 wide, so 80 megabytes of second SCSI. Nice and fast, 2 ISA slots, 4 PCI slots, of course HP, standard I/O, 4 memory banks up to 1 GB of memory. And let's see, I now have 2 Pentium 3 450s installed, and I think that is fine. You don't need like the higher Pentium CPUs, because this is a nice sweet spot with the two 450s, 1 GB of memory, like a Matrix G400 or a Voodoo 3 or a Riva T1 or a Riva T2 Ultra or GeForce 1, and then like an ABIT 64 3-core network card, and you have a perfect balanced setup. So yeah, this is just an amazing motherboard. And here in the box, yes, I have a brand new one, and there goes Floppy. The SCSI drivers. So the manual, the CD with the stickers, and the manual for the Adaptec SCSI, our original I/O shield with a LAN possibility, but there was never a P2B DLS. Later they made other Asus motherboards with the DLS, but not with the 440BX chipset. And yeah, here's the motherboard. It's the same as that one, and all the cables. And someday I probably gonna build a system with this motherboard because it's just so good. Maybe I can take out the motherboard from the Asus BP6 build and just put this in and go for the expensive option back in the days that everyone wanted to have, but they went for this one. But later more information about the ABIT BP6 because it's also in this video. So instead of the Asus P2BF, you also have an Asus P3BF, and this is the latest 440BX chipset motherboard for single CPU. So you have here dip switches to set up the CPU speeds, or you can go in the BIOS and set it in a soft menu. So that is really great about this motherboard. It also supports way more options in terms of overclocking. So if you really want to have a good motherboard, find an Asus P3BF. This one has one ISA slot. ISA was not so popular anymore because sound cards also went to PCI with Sound Blaster Live with 4-channel, because they never made the ABIT 64 Gold Mark II with 4-speaker output. They switched it to the Sound Blaster Live platform. So that's why Asus decided, let's get rid of one more ISA slot and go for 6 PCI slots. But what I also found out, there's another variant of the Asus P3BF. But here I have the ultimate Asus P3BF. There's also a version with still 2 ISA slots and 5 PCI slots. So this is even a revision 4, and this is a revision 3. So this is even a newer revision with a better layout and also the standard I/O layout, but now with the colored connections. And this is just a rock solid motherboard without any special features. Normal IDE 33 MHz, also 1 GB memory support, slot 1. This is just a great motherboard. Stick in a Pentium 3 450 to 600 and yeah, you have a great gaming setup for all the games up to 98. It's just an amazing board. But what if you really want to overclock? The Asus P3BF can overclock, but there's a better overclock motherboard, and that is this one, the ABIT BP6 2. This is an absolute insane overclocking motherboard. The only issue with a motherboard like this is the caps of ABIT were crap. So this board is already recapped because they were all broken. And a little disappointed about ABIT motherboards, they only put in 3 memory slots instead of 4. So this motherboard only supports 768 megabytes of memory, so 3 sticks of 256 megabytes. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage. They included a high point IDE controller with ATA 66, but my advice is, if you care about your data, skip those ports because they aren't so stable and you can lose data. And also around this board, the IBM Dead Stars were very popular. Yeah. I never found a working IBM Dead Star, so they all died. This motherboard has dip switches here, but leave it at standard. Go into the BIOS, they have soft menu 2. And soft menu 2 is insane. You can set the front side bus from 66 MHz up to 200 MHz with increments of 1 MHz. So you can super fine tune this motherboard for overclocking. So this is really the overclocking king of the 440BX chipset motherboard, because you can run the chipset 100% over spec, so on double speed. Not sure if someone ever made it that far, but what I have done previously in a live stream, played with this motherboard with different CPUs to try out how far I could go, and I had like Pentium 3 600s running I think 950 MHz on this board, like insane. And the CPU right now is a little bit odd CPU, because this is a Pentium 3 533B, 512 kilobyte of cache, which is running at half speed, and the front side bus of this CPU is 133 MHz. And I didn't use this CPU to overclock the CPU, but I use this to see how far I can go with the front side bus on this motherboard, because I have here an Acer stick 256 megabyte PC133 CL2. So it's a pretty fast stick. There are not many around that are like CL2 PC133, but the advantage is if you put this stick on CL3, it's way faster. And I think I managed on this motherboard a front side bus over 180 megahertz, so maybe 183, like insane speeds for a board like this. But then you also overclock the HCP and the PCI slots and yeah, it doesn't get stable, because if the chipset runs on 100 megahertz, the PCI divider makes the slots run on 66 MHz. But if you run the chipset on 133 MHz, the PCI divider makes the PCI slot run on 44 MHz. So that is, yeah, that's pretty much over spec for some cards. But some cards work if you use this with 133 or 140 MHz frontside bus. Make sure your cards are compatible with the higher speeds. But it's fun to play with, but to be honest, the overclocking of this kind of platforms is fun to play with, but it's not necessary. If you want to have more speed, just take a newer generation CPU and motherboard. Like an Asus L2 with a Pentium 3 1 GHz. That will always blow the performance of this motherboard out of the water, because a way newer CPU and not overclocked PCI slots. So yeah, if you want to have more speed, just go newer generations of hardware, but just play with this kind of stuff and see what's possible. But really, overclocking is not really necessary anymore for platforms like this. The Asus P2B-DS, I think you have only the basic front side bus options. We have a front side bus of 50 MHz, 66, 75, 83, 100, 103 and 112. So this motherboard supports a little bit of tweaking and mini overclocking, but if you put like the CPUs from 100 MHz frontside bus to 103, everything just runs like 3% faster, and probably many CPUs also support 112, and then everything is 12% faster, the memory, the buses. So a little overclock like that can help. Yeah, just go with standard CPU speeds, it's fine. And with two CPUs, Windows 2000 will get really snappy and fast. And if you do a little bit of multitasking, you really feel that Windows will be faster with 2 CPUs. And now a pretty special motherboard, the ABIT BP6. And the ABIT BP6 was like a hacked motherboard design, because Intel never wanted to support this, and they realized, oh yeah, we F up, because this motherboard has two socket 370s. Intel made the socket 370s for the Celerons and later the Pentium 3s, and ABIT decided, oh, if we take the 440BX chipset, we can run the Celerons and dual CPU support. And Intel forgot to disable it in the CPUs. So the Celerons were just the same as the Pentium 2s and 3s in terms of core, with less cache, but the instructions and the possibilities were the same. Later they switched it off because of constructions like this. And this is also a really good overclocking motherboard. If you take like Celeron 366 CPUs that run on 66 MHz frontside bus, and you put it on 100 MHz frontside bus with a little bit more voltage sometimes, and some alpha coolers with IS-Tech fans like the real deal, or Delta fans, then you have like a dual Celeron 550 MHz, and then this board outperforms this dual Pentium 3 450, and it's probably the same speed as the dual Pentium 3 500. This motherboard has two ISA slots, 1 HP, 5 PCI. Also the Highpoint ATA 66 controller, don't use it. It's not worth to lose any data over it. And also this motherboard had to be recapped because ABIT didn't use really good caps. But this board is in really good shape, and I like the coolers on it. And also this board has only 3 memory banks. So yeah, that's a compromise that ABIT took. They were thinking, oh, 265 megabytes of memory is more than enough. No, just go up to 1 gigabyte with the Asus boards. But you can't go wrong with any of those boards. So the Asus P2B is good. The Asus P2BF is good, but those are not overclocking motherboards. Then you have the Asus P2B-DS, so with the dual support, great motherboard, no overclocking, super stable, super cool platform. Then you have the Asus P3BF, that is the Asus variant of the overclocking motherboard. Great motherboard, supports like the later slot CPUs if you run it at 132 MHz frontside bus and with extra a lot of options on those boards. But if you really want to overclock, get the ABIT BP6 Mark II, and then with the soft menu you can tweak it on 1 MHz. Yeah, it's insane. Or if you find one, get an ABIT BP6 with the dual Celerons and play with that platform. But if I need to choose between an ABIT BP6 or an Asus P2B-DS, I would choose Asus because of the SCSI on board. And nowadays there's not much price difference between the platforms. But in the early days this was like half price of what this was. So that's why they made the dual Celeron boards, because it was just insane to run so cheaply dual CPU. Because this was a proper workstation motherboard and that was a consumer enthusiastic great option. So let me know in the comments which motherboards you have with the Intel 440BX chipset, so people can read that and maybe write something why you like it or dislike it, so people can read the comments and see more options. Because the issue is, if you talk about this hardware on YouTube, people will go to eBay and maybe the prices will raise. So if we just make a list in the comments of all the other options, we will spread the prices a little bit more, and maybe don't buy it directly, but put it on a list that you want it, and you will find boards like this for cheap or for free someday, because they are pretty common. And even the Asus P2B-DS's or the P2B-D with autoscoocy, I have somewhere 2 of those, you still can find them for pretty decent prices. Probably if you buy it like in a box brand new, you pay way too much money, but just look around, you will find Asus 440BX motherboards for pretty cheap if you are not too picky. But if you find one of those Asus or Abit boards, go for it. And if you like to support me, you can support me monthly on Patreon, and you can get access to my Discord server where we discuss hardware like this, or memes, or things about life. It's just a great little community, and you can share pictures and yeah, links, and yeah, come check it out. And thanks for watching.